Ah yes, The Simpsons. The show really doesn't need any introduction, does it? I mean, everyone under dogs has heard about the show and how integral it became to 90s pop culture. It's one of the most popular cartoons of all time, one that's still airing to this very day, and despite the fact that the show has been on a decline for over, well, twice as long as the show's golden age in the 90s. Yeah, it's really been that long. You can never really take away the influence from The Simpsons, even if you try to. But why is the show so essential? Well, I could give you a short answer, but you know what? I thought it would be fun to go through all of the seasons and see how the show started, when it got really, really good, and when it started to, well, fell off. That's right, I'm going to be watching every episode of The Simpsons. Well, actually, maybe not. I feel like by the 2010s, it's all going to become, well, a blur to endure, but I at the very least want to see how long it can last. Like, at the very least, get to experience the show's long golden age. I mean, I have seen a handful of episodes from the show's golden age, but still, I want to, experience the whole thing. So yeah, that's what the series is going to be focused on. I'm going to be doing a video series where I'll be ranking the episodes for every season as we go along, starting with season 1 and continuing forward chronologically till, well, I don't know, we'll have to see. So yeah, let's not waste any more time, let's start with the ranking. So yeah, season 1. Despite being commonly seen as an admirable but still fairly rocky first season of the series, and one that is up to debate whether it actually belongs in the show's golden age or not. Actually, most people will argue that it began in season 3 or so. I don't think season 1 has really any episode that I will consider to be, well, straight up bad. However, I think there are a few rather weak ones that I'm pretty mixed on. Homer's Odyssey is weird because how I feel about it very much depends on what part of the episode is focused on. I mean, you have the first third of the episode, which I think is pretty good, especially with the whole gag of the kid trying to avoid vomiting during the school bus trip. I think that's pretty fun. And the last third of the episode is also not bad, although fairly forgettable and somewhat dull, honestly. But my main issue with the episode always lied on the middle section. Homer's Odyssey is in a way the most dark episode of season 1. It's tackling a topic as sensitive as suicide here, and while the episode does have the heart and won't really say that it feels ungenuine in any way, it's still just not very good at pulling it off. Like when Homer decides to end his life, there's just not that much of a natural progression to it, like it just kind of comes off out of nowhere. And yeah, getting fired from your job and struggling to get a new one can lead you into thinking about killing yourself. The thing is, we don't really see a series of events where Homer gets progressively more depressed. Like, I don't think I would have guessed that the episode was going to take that serious of a route this suddenly after Homer breaks Bart's piggy bank. There's a lot of crude animation scenes in the episode as well that feel very awkward and sloppy, which yeah, most of the season is very crude and sloppy animation wise, but I feel like this is one of the few episodes where it gets a little bit too crude and sloppy. But I think the most awkward scene of the whole episode, probably the whole show, is when the family tries to stop Homer from ending his life. Like, I cannot even describe it properly. The whole sequence just feels straight up unnatural in every way, from the way the characters talk to each other, to Homer's entire speech, to how the dialogue transitions. It's just really bizarre. Yeah, that's kind of the thing, honestly. Out of all the episodes from season 1, this is definitely the one that feels the most awkward out of all of them. Like I said, there's plenty of moments that I do enjoy from the first third and even the last third of the episode, but I just really don't like the middle section. If Homer's Odyssey is the most awkward episode of the first season, Homer's Night Out I would say it's the most weird. I think it's better than Homer's Odyssey just on the fact that it's far less awkward. Like, the episode does actually function properly and naturally, if you get what I mean. I don't think you can actually. But unfortunately the episode still held back a lot by its really weird plot. Basically, Bart gets a mini spy camera from a mail order and uses it to take a picture of Homer dancing next to a belly dancer. Bart shows the photo to some friends in school, and that basically leads to the picture being spread around to everyone in Springfield, making Homer a popular figure. I think what I don't like about the episode is the amount of half-baked moments that come along with it. Like, I don't understand why this single photo makes Homer suddenly a popular figure in the town, or why Marge gets so upset about the photo that he throws Homer out of the house. Oh wait, we actually find out that her whole reason is to teach Bart a lesson about treating women. Yeah, for a godforsaken photo. I mean, it's very clear what was the theme and message that the episode was trying to convey here, but it just feels too half-baked and the implications are just barely established that well. It doesn't really work as a result. It kind of has a common problem with season 1 where a lot of things just happen because, well, they happened. Like, the show has been very satirical about America since the very start, but I do often get the feeling that the show during the first season doesn't really want to elaborate on its satire a few times. And this episode is definitely the most emblematic about it. If I were to talk about positives though, it does have plenty of funny moments across it, especially when Homer moves to live in Barney's house. And you know, it does have a pretty sweet ending, despite the fact that the setup to it is, well, pretty poor, but yeah, I mean, this episode is also just not very good. Okay, so quick history lesson. Despite this being the last season 1 episode to ever be broadcast on TV, Some Enchanted Evening was actually the first produced episode for the entire series. In short, what happened basically was that the staff, in particular James Brooks, was not satisfied with how the first version of the episode turned out. And yeah, that basically led to the episode being delayed for months to, well, fix any problems that the episode had. So yeah, instead of this being the official first episode of the entire series, the Christmas special ended up taking that spot instead. And honestly, I don't think this episode is really that bad. I think it's fine. I think the only major problem that I have with the episode is that it kind of feels like two separate episodes that feel very loosely tied together into one episode. Like, at first it deals with Marge's frustration about how much of an uncaring husband Homer is, but then you have the second half, which is about Homer taking Marge out of dinner while the kids have to deal with this evil babysitter. And everything that happens throughout the second half of the episode happens because Homer comes back to the house with some gifts, and yeah, apparently that's enough for Marge to forgive him entirely. Like, it feels like the episode is just jumping from one mood to another one very quickly. Also because this is the first produced episode for the show, and given how generally rough the animation of the first season can be, this episode does suffer from a lot of scenes looking kind of uncanny and pretty weird. The most infamous one being this suddenly really well animated scene that happens for like a few seconds before it jumps back to the standard animation. Yeah, I remember seeing people talk about this scene in particular like a lot on Twitter. But aside from that, I mean, I don't really have many problems with the episode otherwise. Like, there's plenty of decent jokes, it's pretty entertaining, and as different as the first and second half of the episode is, I mean, they're still pretty enjoyable to watch on their own right. So yeah, I don't think this episode is bad at all. I just think it's far from an amazing one. Okay, so I think from here on now, we're going to be talking about episodes that I at the very least can say I like. I actually remember not being really a fan of this one when I first saw it through a rerun on TV like several years ago, but you know what, it's definitely better than I remembered. So one of the most persistent things about the first season is that the characters around that time were actually kind of different compared to how they will act seasons later. And that was especially the case with Homer. Like, he's not a completely different character in season 1, but you can tell the writers had kind of a different focus on his character. Like, he was even sometimes the voice of reason, which is, well, certainly interesting. And if you're wondering why I'm talking about this in this segment, it's because, well, this is probably the episode that highlights that aspect the most. I mean, you basically have Homer being worried that his family isn't as decent as most of the other families in Springfield. So, you know, that at the very least should tell you a lot. And yeah, I'm gonna be honest, I actually quite enjoyed this side of Homer. I think there's several fun bits in here, like when they go through the neighborhood and peek outside of the windows of other families' houses, or the whole therapy scene, which is just generally great. Like, it's basically the scene that highlights just how much of a dysfunctional family the Simpsons are the most, at the very least from season 1. Yeah, it's honestly pretty funny. And I also like the scene where Homer is imagining his family as demons. I mentioned it before that there were times where I didn't really like the crudeness of season 1 despite, well, enjoying it overall, but I think there are times when it's honestly kind of the opposite case. Like, I don't think this scene will be as entertaining on even a golden era season because, well, the weird visuals is what I really like about it. Yeah, this episode is pretty good. I mean, I don't think it necessarily has anything particularly outstanding about it, but it is pretty entertaining throughout. And And this one is also pretty good. Bart the General marks several things for the series in that this is the first episode where we get to see Nelson, the other bullies, and Grandpa, and at the very least, as far as introducing the kind of characters they are, I think it's a pretty good introduction. Although their characters here are still at a fairly surface level. Yeah, I mean, this one is also pretty entertaining throughout. It has a fairly standard and simple plot of Bart and the rest of the kids trying to take down Nelson and the bullies that, works fairly well. There's several fun references to several movies like Full Metal Jacket or Patton, and it's just generally a pretty memorable episode. Again, it doesn't do anything particularly outstanding, and I could argue that the scene of the whole training montage does go for a little bit too long and isn't nearly as entertaining as the rest of the episode, but I mean still, this is a pretty fun one. This is actually another one that I remember seeing back in the day, and even though I do remember liking this episode, I had very little recollection of what actually happened throughout the episode before rewatching it for this marathon. Thankfully though, this one does remain to be a pretty funny one. It's probably the most out there plot of the first season, where Homer gets an RV and then he gets lost in the woods with the family after ignoring Marge's suggestion to get back to the main road, leading into the RV falling off a cliff. The whole montage of the family purchasing the RV is entertaining enough, although a little bit too dragged out in my opinion, but when they get lost in the woods, well, that's definitely the fun part. There's a lot of things that I really like about the episode. I like how Maggie, despite being a baby, actually manages to live better in the woods than both Homer and Bart. I love how Homer ends up covering himself in mud so much that he ends up being mistaken as Bigfoot and actually ends up appearing on TV, which, by the way, it's a beautiful way to end the episode. And I just generally really like the setting that the episode takes place in for the most part. It's a pretty out there setting for a Simpsons episode, at the very least at the time it was. I don't know how common the settings are gonna get in the later seasons, but I guess we'll have to see. But yeah, I mean, this is a pretty good episode. Yes, this is yet another one that I remember watching back in the day. Watching season 1 is making me realize that I watched more episodes from the season than I actually remembered. And yeah, as a matter of fact, not only this is an episode that I've watched before, I think this is probably the first episode of season 1 that I actually remember watching. Which is in a way fitting, considering that this is the second episode in production, and the first episode to pretty much convince the writers that, well, The Simpsons was actually a show we're doing after it didn't really go so well the first time with Some Shanty Evening. It's an episode that pretty much laid the ground for the more school center and just generally the more Bart center episodes of the show. I don't really find the parts where Bart is hanging out in the more special school all that entertaining, and there's a few crude animation bits threaded as well, although that makes sense considering that this is pretty much the second episode both in production order and in broadcast order. But at the same time, his relationship with his dad is definitely something that I actually really like in the episode, and it's definitely the highlight for me. It just feels really natural and real and yeah, wholesome as well. Like they start to bond more and you get to see just how much in common they tend to share early in the series. Even when Bart ends up confessing that he actually cheated on the test, I mean the episode still ends in a pretty funny way. Yeah, even back in season 1 when the show was less funny, I mean it still had some genuinely funny moments. It's just a very emblematic episode that shows the amount of heart the show, even at the very start, used to have. Also, this is the episode that probably has the earliest Simpsons meme with Skinner's face, so yeah, I mean, there's that. If there's a season 1 episode that doesn't really feel like a season 1 episode, it will have to be this one. And that's mainly on the fact that it has a plot that feels so unique that I'm surprised they did it so early in the show. Like I wouldn't be surprised if they did something like this in like season 7 or something. Oh wait, this is the last episode in production. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Yeah, this episode is pretty interesting. It's the first time when we get to see a location outside of Springfield, that being France. Mostly centered on the poor, depleted farmhouse where Bart moves to during the student exchange. And from there, we get to see the lives of both Bart and the Albanian kid in different places. The scenes with the Albanian kid I think are only really okay. The only really funny thing about it was how Homer was so unaware of the whole thing. But the side plot with Bart I think is genuinely really good. Not only because I like how it pokes fun at how Americans see France, but I think the episode does a really good job at showcasing how miserable Bart is living in there. And the scene where Bart realizes that he actually learned a lot of French while being in there is honestly one of my favorite moments of the episode. It's not a particularly really funny episode, but it definitely feels very well rounded as a whole. So out of all of the season 1 episodes, this is probably the episode where Bart is at his most entertaining and interesting as a character for me. And for plenty of reasons. I like that he's not a stereotypical troublemaker and that he can actually feel guilt for the things he does. But also him deciding to cut off the statue's head to get validation from the bullies that he hangs out with is a pretty realistic and grounded view that the episode explores on. And yeah, the scene where the family goes to church is also pretty entertaining. Not really related to me talking about Bart, but I just want to mention it out because, I don't know, I think it's pretty funny. The show has just been really good when it comes to family dynamics from the very start. Yeah, I don't really have any problems with this one. It's an episode that has a lot of heart, plenty of funny moments, and it's very memorable on its own right. Hey, the episode was referenced in a South Park episode, so that gotta mean something. Life on the Fast Lane, it's a really good episode. I'm surprised that I never really see people talk about it because it has a lot of things that I think are very remarkable about it. This is another episode of the season that deals with Marge being upset with Homer as a caring husband, a conflict that is originated by the fact that Homer didn't remember his wife's birthday. And I like this episode a lot more than the other Marge upset center episode, not just because it's actually centered on the conflict throughout the whole episode, and it actually explores more of it, but it's just throughout a very interesting setup. And I also really like everything with the guy that tries to seduce Marge throughout the rest of the episode. I think it's really interesting, not just because of the way that the guy tries to seduce Marge, but also centers on Homer's worries and depression. With Bart and Lisa worrying about this situation as well, thinking they're going to get into a divorce. And yeah, I also really like this one small thing about Lisa talking about the 8 stages that kids go through when their parents' marriage is falling. I know that it doesn't sound like something worth bringing up, but I don't know, I think it's a cute detail. But yeah, I think this is probably the most underrated episode of the first season to me. Well, actually, either this episode or... There's a lot of people out there that find Lisa as a character to be generally pretty annoying and the weakest character in the Simpsons family. But I don't know, so far at the very least since season 1, whenever the show is focused on her, it's done in a way that I think it's actually pretty intriguing, and Morning Lisa is the best example of this. Unlike Homer's Odyssey, this episode does actually explore depression really well. It's a situation where Lisa finds herself to be constantly depressed and empty on an average day, but her family doesn't really seem to understand clearly her emotions. And I like it, not only because it portrays the feeling of emptiness in a pretty poignant way, but I also like how the episode takes an interesting route later on by having Lisa channel her emotion through jazz, and she even shares it with a jazz musician. It's an episode that has a lot to say, and it's interpreted in a way that I think it's very unique, in that so much of the value of art just comes down to emotional and human expression. It's a natural, satisfying response that comes from releasing a certain feeling, and it's not just depressive thoughts, but it could be anything. I also like how the episode pokes fun at little things like the noise and ignorance that happens throughout the school, things like the food fight or the progress report from school that informs that Lisa was too sad to play dodgeball. Like even back then when the show wasn't quite as funny as season 1, they still had the satire on point. Yeah, I think this is just generally a great episode that really gives a fully realized insight to Lisa as a character. It's not a particularly really funny episode or anything, but it's a very strong one when it comes to the themes that it tackles. Well, now it's time to talk about the actual first episode of the series. Despite this being a Christmas special, despite this being the only Simpsons episode to ever air in the 80s, as late as December 1989, and despite this being the 8th episode in production order, this is honestly a pretty great TV show pilot, and yeah, a pretty great episode on its own as well. Out of all of the episodes from this season, this is honestly the most charming and heartfelt of them all. Part of the reason is, yeah, it's a Christmas special. Naturally, a lot of the holidays magic is going to transfer over to this episode. But still, this is an episode that I always just get a lot of joy watching. It's a kind of episode that really does showcase just how real and human the show was back then. And I think it also very much properly introduces the Simpsons family and how dysfunctional they are, but in a pretty grounded way. And yeah, I don't really have much to say about this one. I think it's just a really heartfelt episode, and definitely one that I'm most likely to put at the very least every December or so. Like I said before, it's pretty great. However, I think Krusty Gets Busted is definitely for sure the best episode of season 1, and honestly, the closest to the quality of the later seasons. Later as in seasons 3 to 8, I don't know, we'll get there when we get there. But anyways, Krusty Gets Busted, just an all around great episode that I don't even have any problems with, honestly. It's the first episode of the show that is primarily focused on Krusty and Sideshow Bob, and I think it perfectly establishes the kind of characters these two are, especially Sideshow Bob, where we get to see a good insight of his lunatic behavior and how he manages to get away with his crime. That is before Bart and Lisa's investigation. This episode is my favorite of the season for many things. I mean, the satire is on point the most here, the plot is arguably the most exciting and cinematic we've seen from the show yet, the conflict is interesting, there's a lot of funny moments, and it's just explored really well. It's an episode that really feels essential on a world building standpoint. Like previous episodes, you're really more focused on the family than anything else. But this is truly the episode that really does expand the world of the series in a way where you really care for what happens in Springfield. And I also really like how Bart is a big fan of the show, how devastated he gets when he hears the news, and how he's willing to prove that his hero was actually innocent. Oh, and yeah, this is the first episode that features Itchy and Scratchy, which is pretty cool. Yeah, I don't really have much else to say about it. It's my favorite episode of the first season, and if you're a fan of the series who hasn't seen this episode, I mean, I will very much recommend giving it a watch. And yeah, that was pretty much season 1. From here on onwards, I do expect the show to get better and better before, well, it gets worse and worse. But as far as the first season goes, I mean, I think it's pretty good. Yeah, the animation can be too crude at times, it's not as funny as the seasons to follow, and the characters were still not fully defined yet. But that's honestly what I came to expect for a show that at the time was just barely starting. And I think season 1 does have a lot of things that are very crucial to Golden Age Simpsons, like the clever satire or pretty much the fact that the show just feels so alive and real. It's certainly a unique experience with episodes that do feel like they have a lot of soul to them. So yeah, for the most part I did enjoy myself watching season 1. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's a great season because it's certainly flawed in many areas, but I still think it's a good season overall, and I think I'll be putting season 1 in the B tier. And yes, I'm going to be ranking these seasons in that tier list as I continue watching the show. I think it'll be fun. But yeah, that's pretty much for today. Stay tuned for season 2 and I'll see you in the next video.